Hello, my name's Julian Edgar and I'm the author of this book, Designing and Building a New Energy Efficient Home. What I want to talk about in today's video is the fact that passive solar is not the same as Passivhaus or passive house as sometimes people pronounce it. I'd prefer the German one to differentiate it more. Passive solar is not the same as the standard that's called passive house. Let's have a look. So, as I've said, it's not the same. It's a completely different thing. And I think that in nearly all southern Australian climates, like 95% of them, passive house is much inferior. I do not think it's a good approach for southern Australia. I think it has a multitude of deficiencies. And that's really important to state up front because the web in Australia is flooded with promotional material for passive house. There are numerous sites selling architectural services, selling equipment services, selling testing services, all for passive house. Now, why are they promoting it so strongly? I think there are some very interesting questions there as well. Let's have a look firstly at what the standard comprises. So passive house is a voluntary standard that originated in Northern Europe and actually in Germany. And it uses 5 fundamental architectural principles. And it's worth looking at these in some detail because often you'll find promoters add their own, just make up ones and add them in, or try and undersell some of these if they don't fit the prevailing narrative. These are the 5 official principles that all passive house are meant to use. Super insulated building envelopes. Typically in Australia, double the normal insulation. Now you might say, oh, well, that's not too bad. It won't cost too much. But as we'll see in a moment, it costs a great deal because normally you've got to change the wall construction to get so much insulation in. Airtight construction. The house is sealed as tightly as possible so no air can come in or out. How do you breathe? We'll get to that in a moment. Construction without thermal bridges. Lots and lots of effort is put into getting rid of any thermal bridges that can transfer heat from inside to out or from outside to in. Very high performance windows and external doors, often triple glazed, often imported from Europe, always expensive. I have never seen a passive house in Australia that doesn't have very expensive windows and external doors. Now, how do you breathe? Well, you have a mechanical ventilator, often with heat recovery, that is, it uses a heat exchanger. So the air that you breathe gets brought in by a mechanical ventilator into the house and stale air gets removed. And this mechanical ventilator is operating 24/7. Otherwise, the air in the house would become stale very quickly. Those are the 5 principles that underpin passive house. And they are the same principles used anywhere in the world that a passive house is built. Now, if you're thinking it doesn't matter what climate it's in, they still just do this, you'd be absolutely right. Very interesting, isn't it? Now, notice what they don't have there in those 5 principles that are in passive solar. Let's have a look. Thermal mass is intrinsic to passive solar design. It's not included as one of the 5 principles in passive house. Orientation is intrinsic to passive solar design. It's not included as one of the principles in passive house. Natural ventilation, actually getting air from outside to breathe, to cool you and so on, is intrinsic to passive solar and it's not one of the principles in passive house. And using sunshine to warm the house in winter is also intrinsic to passive solar. It's not one of the principles of passive house. So you can see there are very substantial differences between the two. In fact, I would suggest they're coming from completely different directions. And so if you talk to someone and someone is trying to sell you passive house and they sort of blur them and say, oh, this is just like passive solar, it actually is not. It is completely different in its approach. So what are some of the problems? Well, I think there are lots. The first and most major is cost. I'm going to expand on each of these in a moment. The second major problem is passive house tries to shut the climate out. It It shuts the climate out with very high performance windows, very high performance external doors. It shuts the climate out by sealing the house up as tightly as possible. The whole approach is to try to exclude the climate, whereas of course passive solar, you're actually working with the climate, using sunshine to help warm you in winter, using night breezes in summer to help cool the thermal mass and so on. The third problem with passive house is it has quite poor summer performance. Now, no one will tell you that. They'll go, oh, no, it's all fine. Have a look at this logging. And you'll find that the logging of their passive house is with the air conditioner running. We'll look at why it has poor summer performance in a moment, but you can probably already guess. If thermal mass is not a major ingredient in a passive house, how does it keep cool in summer? It can't without using the air conditioner. And the fourth major problem is poor resilience. What happens in a power failure? Now, we'll get to that in a moment, but I hope you're already thinking, hey, hold on, the ventilator goes off. You only have stale air to breathe. So let's look at each of these. Cost. I think this is the biggest. If passive house cost the same as a normal Australian house, I'd still have some difficulties with it, but the difficulties wouldn't be huge as they are currently. Because while they'll never tell you this, they'll say things like, oh, only costs 7% more. What, 7% more than what? Oh, a really expensive architecturally designed house. While they'll never tell you this, passive house in Australia costs between 50 and 100% more than a normal Australian house. Now, don't believe me. Go to some of the promotional associations and look at their showcase of passive house in Australia. They've got heaps of houses you can look at. Go to the specification list and start looking at the ingredients that went into that house. The special insulation, the special windows, the special external doors, the special architecture, the special consultants, because you need a passive house consultant, the special testing before it gets its accreditation, which also is going to cost you for the certification. If you look down that list, it is bleedingly obvious that a passive house must cost substantially more than a normal Australian house. And remember, a passive solar normal Australian house can work extremely effectively and cost no more at all than a normal Australian house. It does it by orientation, it does it by thermal mass, which is already built into the house. It does it by opening the house in summer and letting ventilation flows and so on. So cost is the single biggest problem of passive house in Australia because it is such an expensive architectural approach. My second concern is it really works against the climate, not with it. Now, if we've learned anything over the last 100 years of humans working in the environment and often despoiling the environment and causing major environmental problems, it is that we as people should work with the climate rather than against it. We should work with the environment rather than against it. Now, passive house attempts to seal the occupants off from the climate. Now, when I say that to people, they say, oh, you can still open a window, but opening a window is not actually designed into the way the house functions. Why? Because that's why it has its mechanical ventilator, so you don't have to open a window. You don't have thermal mass to cool in summer by opening windows and letting air flow through. You are sealed off from the climate. And I saw one passive house proponent say, it's like living in a thermos flask. Wow, I don't want to live in a thermos flask. Passive house has no need to use orientation. Yes, it's in the software, it's in their design software, but it's not one of the design principles. You don't have to really pay much attention to it as a fundamental principle. It doesn't use winter sunshine for heating and so on. Really, it works against the climate, and the best epitome of that is the same approach is used in any climate in the world. Those same 5 principles are used. They don't change depending on the climate. The third major problem with passive house in Australia is its poor summer performance. Now, passive house without air conditioning, so one that's accredited without air conditioning, can have 10% of the hours in a year over 25 degrees C inside the house with no upper limit. So 10% of all the hours of a year can be over 25 and as high as you want and still pass accreditation. Now that's astonishingly bad performance. That means that 9.7 hours of every single day of the Australian summer, it can be over 25 degrees inside with no upper limit. So it could be 30, it could be 32. It doesn't matter, it still passes accreditation. Now you very quickly see from that, while as far as I'm aware, all passive house in Australia use air conditioning. I can't see how they'd be livable without it because they don't have any thermal mass to absorb the heat inside. It's not one of their principles, remember. Some choose to have thermal mass, but it's not one of their design principles. And so how can they do anything other than get hotter and hotter and hotter as the temperature goes up outside? There's no way of getting rid of that heat. So they use air conditioning. Now, you might say, well, that's okay. Lots of houses use air conditioning, but lots of houses don't cost 50 to 100% more than a normal Australian house. So you're paying that enormous premium and you're not even getting very good summer performance. The fourth one, poor resilience. What happens in a power failure? Well, you lose your air conditioning in summer, and we've just seen how that's actually required. I was looking at some logging on a passive house without air conditioning yesterday. It was 29 degrees inside when it was 40 outside, and that was a peak of 40 for one day. It wasn't a 6 days in a row of 40. My guess is 5 or 6 days in a row at 38, 40 degrees, and it probably would have been about 33 or 34 inside. That's my guess based on the trend of that graph. So passive house entirely rely on power for air conditioning, and they entirely rely on power to keep that ventilator working. So if the ventilator goes off, the carbon dioxide level in the house is going to go up, and my logging of carbon dioxide in houses shows that it can actually go up quite fast. It's the quickest response parameter that I'm actually logging. You have no ventilator. Okay, so you open the insulated envelope, the heavily insulated envelope, open a window or a door that gets hot. You can't have it both ways. If your ventilator doesn't work, you have to open the house. You've got no thermal mass, so it'll get hot too. So in a power failure that went for days in summer, I just think it would be horrendous. It's got no ability to work effectively without the power. What a terrible way of organising a house. Now, passive house in Australia is very strongly promoted. And I think that many of the people and the companies doing it, they genuinely believe the passive house talking points. And there's a whole bunch of talking points that they'll come up with time and time again. It has better quality air and 90% reduction in energy use and all these things which are highly debatable, but they're repeated by everyone. But I also think, despite the fact that I think they probably believe it, I also think they haven't widely researched in the field. A lot of passive house proponents seem to know absolutely nothing about any other approach. Nothing. They haven't explored any other approach. They've just learned this one and therefore they think it's the best. A lot of passive house proponents in Australia are selling expensive products. They're selling expensive windows, they're selling expensive external doors, they're selling testing techniques, they're selling architectural services, they're selling passive house consultancy services, they're selling expensive products. And that's certainly something to keep very much in mind. And I think some of them want to sell expensive houses. If you are working on a percentage of the house and the house costs 50 or 100% more than a normal house, you're going to end up with 50 or 100% more in your pocket, and that's pretty substantial. So I think it's an interesting mix of people who I would say have fallen for the Kool-Aid and genuinely believe what they're saying because they're quite passionate about it, but also they've got heavily vested interest, financial interest in promoting it, and I think they have very rarely have looked widely at other approaches to energy efficient house design. So if you are considering a passive house, ask a lot of questions and really ask questions about cost and tie that cost down as tightly as you possibly can. I have talked to a passive house owner. I've visited 2 passive houses, and when I talked to one owner, he was talking about the process of the architectural development of the house, and he said words to the effect of, well, at that stage, everything went up by 30%. And I just looked at him, and I didn't want to be rude and say, well, why didn't you bail at that point? Why didn't you say, no thanks, see ya? People seem to get involved in the process and the costs go up and up and, oh, well, we'll need that and we'll need that. And suddenly we're talking about these extraordinarily expensive houses. So if you're considering a passive house, ask a lot of questions, especially about cost. And if you are told, well, that's what's needed for a energy efficient home, you just simply have to pay this much money, you will now know, if you've watched these videos, that that is absolute rubbish. I was going to say BS. That's absolute BS. You can have a highly energy efficient house which is comfortable and healthy and costs the same as a normal Australian cost, or just a tiny, tiny premium, like 5 or 7%. That's what I cover in my book, How to Build One of Those Houses at a Normal Cost, Designing and Building a New Energy Efficient Home. The book is out mid-late 2026. I'm waiting until I have 12 months of logged data for that house. The book is largely written at the moment, but I want to have logged data for winter and for autumn. I have it already for spring and for summer. Thank you.